guys don't know where that is, just let me know, and I'll put another link for that for everybody. All right. So today we're going to be talking about business costs, and there's all these acronyms at the top there that are a little familiar because we've done Learn Smarts and such, right? But before we really talk about businesses and their costs, it's important that we talk about some definitions just related to the business population. So within the business population, right, we've got some related definitions. And so the first definition of import is a plant. So this is not flora, right? This is talking specifically about an establishment where either or production and or distribution take place. Takes, an establishment, so it takes place. So these would be, examples of these would be factories, farms, ranches, websites, and storefronts. So that's a plant. That's the physical entity. So the physical establishment, rather. So secondly, we're going to talk about the legal entity. So this is the firm. So the firm is the business organization. That owns and operates the plants. So, Procter & Gamble, right? They make a lot of our soap and shampoo and deodorant and things like that, right? They're the firm that owns all of the different individual factories and distribution centers that they have. When we're talking about businesses, right, we can group all of these businesses into what are called industries. So an industry is a group of firms that produce either the same or similar products. So some examples of industries, right? i.e., we've got the airline industry or the automobile industry. Now, we are often confused when we talk about firms and stuff like that because many businesses are what we call multi-product firms. Lilu Dallas, multi-product firms. And so what are the different types of multi-product firms? Great question. Let's go into it. So 4 is going to be our types of multi-product firms. So we're going to be using Different types of integrated. We have horizontally integrated, vertically integrated, and then we have the favorite from Rocco's Modern Life, the conglomerate. So the first one we'll talk about here is horizontally integrated. So horizontally integrated means that it's a single firm with multiple plants that's in the same stage of production. So types of, or examples of horizontally integrated firms would be, you know, Macy's department store, right? Or Coca-Cola bottling plants. Compare this to something which is vertically integrated. Use some space down here. Something that's vertically integrated. This is a multi-plant firm in which the company owns plants at different stages of production. So an example of this might be, you know, some steel company that owns ore and coal mines, as well as other different plants at different stages of the steel manufacturing process. And lastly, but definitely not least among any of these, is the conglomerate. So this is a firm that owns plants in different industries and different markets. So a conglomerate, right, would be Procter and Gamble. They produce laundry detergent, soap, feminine products, diapers, all sorts of stuffs. Now they have different names. It's herbal essences and Dial and all this other kind of stuff, right? But all of them are owned by Procter and Gamble. So why do these organizations persist, right? What's the advantage of using a corporation? Because at the end of the day, you know, if you're just doing something on your own, if you're mowing lawns, if you're doing tutoring, you can just be a sole proprietorship You can just work for yourself and have that be pass-through income, right? So why would you go ahead and actually incorporate? So corporations there's a lot of advantages. First and foremost, they can finance their expansion in ways beyond savings from past sales or profit. What do we mean by that? Well, they can sell stocks and bonds. Right? Where stocks represent a share of ownership in the company. So you're able to vote and you get some dividends. But at the end of the day, the return on stocks really has to do with reselling it. Few stocks actually produce a lot of money in terms of their dividends, their yearly payments. Whereas bonds are loans. So bonds have no ownership rights. But they are promised fixed payments. So bonds are the safer return because you know what you're going to get, right? Whereas a stock, like I said, the dividends, they could have paid dividends every year for the last 50 years and then all of a sudden decided, we're going to use that money to buy back more stock this year and not pay dividends. So dividends are these optional things, whereas bonds, if the bond comes due, they got to pay it. Otherwise, some really bad stuff happens. And also, if the company goes bankrupt, then the bondholders get paid out first before the stockholders. So you may end up with absolutely nothing if you're a stockholder compared to a bondholder, where you may get what's called a haircut, right? You may only get a certain percentage amount of the total amount that you invested. But both of them are, good investments for people. Once you start to save for retirement, it's more than likely that your savings are going to be a mixture of stocks and government bonds and other types of corporate bonds and things like that, right? A diversified portfolio for when you retire. So your money's not just sitting there doing absolutely nothing. And so on the other side of it, right, we invest this money, and on the other side, the corporations can then use that and finance expansion. So the reason why these corporate securities are attractive in the first place so securities is kind of the umbrella term for both stocks and bonds. So corporate securities are attractive investment vehicles. I know I'm using kind of a lot of jargon here, but just attractive investment options, right? So you would choose to do this instead of maybe loaning your friend some money or investing in somebody's startup, right? And partly because they are easily bought and sold, and they're often less risky than other types of assets. Crypto's had an amazing run and all, right, but it's still risky to put your money in there. I'm not having my paycheck deposited entirely into a crypto wallet every month, right? So there's still a lot of erraticacy there, erraticness in terms of the, how much that relates to what you can buy with it, how much that relates to the different amounts of currencies, right? But it's also, it's important to keep in mind that just having cash, if you didn't have a bank account and you just had a bunch of cash, that would be risky, right? You might get robbed. If somebody finds out that you have a bunch of cash, even if it's in a safe or something like that, right? I mean, that's, you gotta have a bit more security and defense than your average Joe, right? So these type of assets, they have value above and beyond just their nominal return. So that's a reason why they're attractive for other people. So that's a reason why the corporations are able to, get some returns from that, right? So another reason, another very handy dandy thing about corporations is that these corporate owners, so this, at time can be you, right? If you are, if you bought some GameStop or AMC or something like that, right? You're a corporate owner. And the nice thing about being a corporate owner when you have one of those stock is that you have limited liability. I'm sure that the stockholders of Blizzard Entertainment and EA are very happy that they have limited liability, right? They're getting sued not just from the Department of California, but today the SEC said that they were suing them as well, right? So the SEC and the Department of California Fair Labor Practices are not going to be able to go after the people that have Blizzard or EA stock, right? They're just going after the corporation. There might be some people that are working at the corporation that get indicted or get, charged up on criminal charges, right? It's kind of rare for different reasons, for whatever. But the people that are owning the stocks are not held responsible for that, right? Compared to, if I had a sole proprietorship where I was trimming trees, right? And oops, all of a sudden I trimmed this tree and it fell through somebody's house, right? That person could sue me for the damage to their house, right? There's liability that I have as the sole proprietor of this company, as the person that owns 100% of the company, for what the company does. So when you have a corporation, the people that own the company have this guard, this limited liability safeguard to them. So what does this mean? This means that all of the personal assets beyond the shares of stock are not at risk should the corporation fail. Right, and this is important, a lot of, capitalism, a lot of this, advanced stage in technology and capitalism, right? It's due to financial ingenuity and financial innovation, being able to get the money in the right amounts at the right time to the right people in the right ways, at the right cost, have it be repaid on the right schedule.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Does it change, depending on how much stock you hold? Like, say you have a 50% stock with the company, would you then be held responsible, or no, because you're still just a stockholder?
You're still just a stockholder. Yeah. So if you so let's say you incorporate and then you still maintain a bunch of the stock, a bunch of the which is the plot of a lot of like if you guys have ever watched which is really Succession, which is really great. Like I think it's Showtime or something like that. But it's like about these kind of I think it's actually based on real events. It's based on this conglomerate that started eating up all these small television stations and like dictating what the small television stations said in terms of the evening news and things like that. But yes, so you are still only held liable for the amount that's invested. So if or the amount that's worth. So let's say that I had some amazing idea in some website and some company, and then I end up taking it public or something, but I retain 55% of the company or something, right? And I issue shares, but I issue during that issuance, I issue myself some of those shares. So that's kind of a common practice in terms of founders capital and things like that, right? So then I would essentially lose all of what those shares are worth. So if it's, let's just say it's 100 million shares If I had 55 million shares, they were all $1 each, I would lose $55 million. But that's all like potential money too. You know what I mean? It's never actual money that was in my bank account. If I cash out, then I get to keep that money. So the book talks about how in the 1990s, there was an effort to try and align the what's called this principal agent problem, right? So essentially, it's in the share, like the people that are running the corporations are removed from the shareholders. And so how do you get the people that are running the corporations to do what the shareholders want them to do? So one of the things that they do is they'll tie the performance of those CEOs and those other people to the performance of the stock. Well, then we had Enron in the 1990s, and it was this giant scandal where the CEOs were doing all this illegal and shady stuff in order to pump up the value of the stocks, and then they would sell all their stocks and leave the company before kind of stuff hit the fan, right? And this happened again in 2016 with Wells Fargo, where they had these really predatory practices about opening extra bank accounts for people, right? So I probably had 5 extra bank accounts for Wells Fargo because I was a customer of theirs at one point in the 2000s, and they would just open these extra bank accounts and not tell the customers in order to pad the numbers, so that when the quarterly reports came out, they could say, oh, we added this many customers, and they linked the manager's pay. Like, it wasn't just the CEO's pay, it was like middle management. Their pay was being linked to how many accounts. And so it was this pressure, from this reporting system and from this whole system of their total pay, their total wealth is due to the stock market price. And so they're going to pad that price sometimes through these hollow and disingenuous means, rather than through soundly building the company and soundly building that it's building value and selling a quality product at a low price and so on and so forth. So there are mismatches in that incentive that unfortunately are still not solved, right? In terms of the CEO golden parachutes and stuff, like they're still an issue to these days, right? There's this whole thing about you kind of fail upwards. Excuse me. BoJack Horseman has a great part in it where Todd is the CEO of this corporation, and then he's like fired for something, and instantly a CEO, like the Walt Disney CEO, comes along and is like, hey kid, like I got a job for you. He's like, didn't you hear I just got fired? He's like, oh yeah, but you're part of the CEO club now, like it doesn't matter, we'll just hire you. And it's like very, unfortunately, very true. So there are issues with it. Part of the issue is the huge influence of finance capital on the regulatory people, the Wall Street and the New York, like the Securities Commission, so on and so forth. There's a lot of revolving doors and things like that. But yeah, that's where we start to get more into the political economy stuff, rather than just like the what's going on with the numbers. But great question, very good question. Yeah, absolutely, my pleasure. So they can easily attract this financial capital, right? That's one of the main benefits. And they can exploit what we're going to talk about towards the end of class today, beginning of class on Thursday, these things that are called economies of scale. So essentially, the larger that you are, the cheaper it is to produce things. So the larger that you are, the easier it is to lower your cost and kind of drive other producers or new producers out of business. So we'll talk about that towards the end of this chapter. So these corporations, they can theoretically go on forever. And so this immortality, it promotes growth, long-range planning, and growth. But there should be more things promoting long-range planning and growth. One of my favorite podcast guys, who actually doesn't have a podcast anymore, but his name Mike Pesca. He used to work for NPR, and he was a podcaster for The Gist, and this like true center of the road moderate. I loved him. And he talked at one point about how different the financial landscape would be if we didn't have quarterly reports. That just like the pace of everything is so dictated by the fact that every 3 months these companies have to put out, new numbers and stuff like that. And so as a result, there's a short-term focus in large corporations, right? Just like I said, Wells Fargo, they would push them to, open more accounts, open more accounts, open more accounts. We have to show growth. We have to show growth. And if it wasn't this every 3 months thing, what if it was every 6 months? What if it was every year? What if it was every 2 years? Right? How would that actually fundamentally change the nature of how businesses run? Is a very interesting question, at least interesting question to me. All right, so that principal agent problem, right? We're going to talk about that real quick. So this is a famous problem within economics. And it is quite simply that there are divergent interests of the owners, and those are the principals, and the managers, which are the agents. And these divergent interests, they lead to decisions that are not in the best interests of the owners. So, like I said, the book talks about the Enron, the Arthur Andersen case, how deceptive, sometimes illegal accounting practices were used to inflate the company's stock prices so executives could sell their shares and reap huge windfalls in their wealth. The 2016 case of Wells Fargo employees opening unauthorized accounts for customers to meet sales goals illustrates a principal agent problem involving employees and management. So all of that is in your text if you'd like to know more. More definitions. And then I swear we'll get to the real good stuff. We'll get to some numbers and some cost curves, I promised. But we need to really understand what economic costs are, right? Some of you may be taking business classes at the same time right now, and you may be, taking accounting, right? And costs may mean something very specific to you, right? So economic costs we have to define because they are a little bit different, okay? So these are all the payments that a firm must make, and this is including income, or the incomes it must provide to all the resource suppliers to attract those resources away from their next best alternative production opportunity. So these payments may be in the form of explicit costs, which we talked about in chapter 1 when we talked about opportunity costs, right? Explicit costs are the things that you're actually paying, that you're actually writing a check for, you go and you pay cash for. Implicit costs, these are just the next best opportunity. So these are the things that you give up. And specifically, the next best thing. So not all of the things put together. That's a common mistake that Econ students will make, but the next best thing. So implicit costs, some examples of these, because we know what explicit costs are, right? These are, the cost of a t-shirt, somebody's salary when you pay, a clerk or somebody like that, or a janitor, utilities, keep the lights on, right? We know what explicit costs are. But implicit costs, these are a little bit difficult, right? These, could be the foregone interest on money that you invested. You could have invested that in a safer, kind of asset and gotten some interest on it, right? It could be, foregone wages in the time that it takes you to, run this company. You could be working for somebody else and making so much per hour. And so when we're talking about normal profits, so number one, we're used to accounting profits. So accounting profits, so let's real quick, let's get some numbers in here. It's way too many words for an economics class, right? So let's zoom in here and let's get some numbers going. So if we have total sales revenue of $120,000, and we've got some explicit costs. So we've got the costs of t-shirts, 40,000. We've got the clerk's salary, 18,000. And we've got utilities, got to keep the lights on, aircon on, right, all that stuff. That's going to be 5,000. So we add up all of these things and we get our total explicit costs of $63,000. And so our accounting profit is just equal to that total revenue minus the explicit costs. And so we end up with an accounting profit of $57,000. But there's foregone wages. If you're running this company, if you had, instead of running this company, gone and worked somewhere else, you would have been paid this extra income. And so we have some foregone wages that are going to comprise our implicit profit. So let's go ahead and get rid of this stuff. We'll keep the explicit costs. But let's just redo this. Okay. So we also have foregone wages of $22,000. And then for whatever reason, we also have some foregone entrepreneurial income of $5,000. So that's how much income I've foregone by applying my entrepreneurial abilities to the current retail t-shirt venture rather than applying them to other potential business ventures. Probably the most ephemeral of all of our implicit costs here, right? But doesn't matter. So our implicit costs are going to be this 22,000 plus this 5,000, so it's going to be $27,000. And so now instead of getting $57,000, right, we're going to be subtracting my explicit and my implicit costs from my total revenue, and that's going to give me my economic profits. So it's equal to my total revenue minus my explicit minus my implicit. So it's 120,000 minus 63,000 minus 27,000. 27 plus 63 is 90,000. So we end up with 120 minus 90,000 is 30,000. So they're enjoying abnormal positive economic profits. So the economic profit is telling us that you're making this much more than you could expect to be making in your next best alternative venture. Everybody understand that? So this concept of economic profit is important because the accounting profit can kind of give us a false impression of what's going on, but also in a larger sense, this notion of economic profit steers resources in such a way that is allocatively efficient. Allocatively efficient, a buzzword coming at us a couple chapters later, right? Assuming we're already at productive efficiency, that we are also allocating the resources in such a way that best fits society's needs and wants. So how does it do this? Well, for the most part, these firms are operating in what's called the short run. And the short run is the time period. Literally, it's defined not as like 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. It is defined as however long that is too brief for a firm to alter its plant capacity. What do we mean by plant capacity? So it means that some things are fixed, some things cannot be changed. The size of your factory, the size of this school, right? You know, as we see with the math and science building, right? It takes a long time in order for us to expand the capacity of classrooms or the number of classrooms or things like that, right? It's not the short run. So the short run is just whenever at least one thing cannot be changed. So when we talk about short run costs, those include wages, raw materials, really anything that's used up in production. Whereas if we compare this short run to, you got it, the long run. The long run is a period long enough for all of the quantities of all resources employed, including plant size, to change. So it's long enough for all of the quantities of all the resources employed to change or adjust. So long run costs, these are going to be all of the costs. So these are going to include short-term costs, but also, it's going to be either rent or, lease or mortgage, whatever it's called. This is going to be, your capital, so your equipment and things like that, right? These are all going to be, but this includes the cost of varying the plant size. So within all this stuff, we end up having a bunch of production relationships. And we're going to talk first about short-run production relationships, and then we'll talk about how those bleed into the long run. So 3. Short-run production relationships. So the production cost, obviously, it's going to depend on the quantity that we're producing, right? As well as the price of the resources. So we've got some terms that we need to define here. Total product, right? This is, the same as total output. We've got marginal product. So marginal product is the change in total product. So this is abbreviated as TP. This is abbreviated as MP. Of a particular, the change in the total product resulting from each additional input of a variable resource. So for the most part, we're going to use labor, but it doesn't always have to be labor. So the other definition in here is going to be average product. So pro tip, anytime you see average before something, you just take the whatever that total is, right? So this is just my total product. And then we divide it by, some number of something, right? So here it's going to be the number of workers. And this is also called labor productivity, which makes sense because it's how much per worker each labor is adding on average. So one of the things that's going to really be ruling this whole short-run production relationship is this notion of diminishing returns, specifically the law of diminishing returns. So the law of diminishing returns is really just telling us that as more and more units of the variable resource at some point, the marginal product of additional units of that particular variable input will decline. So, to illustrate this idea, the book goes into a nice example about, how, your score in this class is a function of, the quality of the text and the quality of the instructor and the amount of time you spend in class and the amount of time you spend on your own studying, right? But as additional units of study time per day are added, right? So as you study more and more, we're talking about, within the context of one day, each additional hour will have less of a total impact on your final score. Right? So you get a lot of, bang for your buck in terms of that first hour. If you're not touching econ at all, but you go and read the book and, do one of the quizzes, if you do 1 hour every single day, you're going to get a lot out of it, right? And then if you do, an extra hour on top of it, well, you're still going to get a lot out of it, but, maybe you're fine with getting a B or a C or something, right? You don't want to get an A, so you're just going to do the first hour. But, you get to, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, 15 hours, 16 hours, right? At a certain point, adding an extra hour to study is not going to actually give you any kind of return on your total grade, right? So this happens with all of the variable inputs, and this happens in businesses, not just in our personal lives. So let's go ahead and get into our graphical example here. So this is going to be figure 6-2 from the text. And this is on page 147 here. And so without going into the minutia of what's going on, we're given a production schedule. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And we're talking about labor over here. So this is the number of laborers. And this over here is my total production. And so, workers, right, we're going to assume they're of equal quality. So why is it that their marginal product is diminishing? Well, it's not because more workers are inferior, but it's just that more workers being used relative to the same fixed amount of plant and equipment. So, you have a pizza place and you have one oven, right? And you have 3 waitresses or waiters and you have 1 hostess and you've got 10 tables. Well, at a certain point, adding more waiters or waitresses isn't going to help you to, sling any more pizza every hour, every night, right? Because you're limited by the 1 oven, and you're also limited by the 10 tables, right? So, at first, adding somebody is going to produce a lot of increase. And then that rate that it increases is going to start to slow down. And at some point, it's going to hit some maximum. And sorry, let me do this one more time so I can match it up with the book, because they reach a max at like 6.5. So it goes convex at first, and then concave, reaching a max here, and then decreasing. And so from this period, from this 6.5, right, wherever we hit that top, adding an additional worker actually decreases my IP, my TP, right, my total production. So additional workers at that point, they're running into each other, right? You know, pizzas are getting spilled on the floor. They're chit-chatting in the back when they're not, you know, when the tables need water or whatever the case may be. They could be upselling, right? And so adding workers is actually going to lower my total production at a certain point. Because why? Because I'm fixed the number of ovens, I'm fixed with the number of tables, so on and so forth. Now we compare this to marginal product and average product to figure out what's going on in here. So we're going to link it all together. So at first, we have this period where there's increasing marginal returns. So up until this is called an inflection point. So up until this point, right, the more workers we add, we're getting a really, you know, we're getting an accelerating rate in which the production is increasing. So all the way up until this point, we are enjoying increasing marginal returns. Within this portion right here, we are still experiencing positive marginal returns, but instead of being increasing, they are decreasing or diminishing. Remember that law of diminishing returns, right? And then once we get past that maximum point, at that point, adding more people is actually going to negatively impact our total production, right? So this is the portion that has negative marginal returns. And so, to link this up with our other graph, which talks about the average numbers and the marginal numbers, we find that our marginal product of the first worker is, you know, nearly 12 pizzas or whatever the case may be. So this is 10, this is our first worker, and our red is marginal product. And so what do we think is going to happen to this red curve? Is it going to go up or is it going to go down? Well, since it's our marginal product or our marginal returns, right, and we already labeled this part as increasing marginal returns, this should be going up, right? So the second one is going to give us, you know, about 17.5 or something like that. And at 2.5, that's when we hit this point. So just let me correct that a little bit there in order to hit that. Then what do we think is going to happen to this line once we hit this point? Well, now we're in the point of diminishing marginal returns. And so all the way until we get to the point of negative marginal returns, this is still going to be positive, but it's going to be decreasing. And it doesn't have to be decreasing at a constant rate, but it is. We just happen to draw the curve in a nice way that should be a straight line. And then in our last bit of it, oh, actually I wanted to do that purple too, to keep with my theme. So back up, then I can redo it anyways. No, don't convert stuff. You're gonna crash if that happens. Little Microsoft product that could. All right, so that is our diminishing marginal returns, and then our negative marginal returns is going to be after that 6.5, because literally at that point, by adding. So if we went from a 7th worker to an 8th worker, right? An 8th worker, our marginal product, that's going to be a marginal product of -1, right? Which makes sense because what happens when we go from 7 to 8, our marginal product decreases by almost a full square, right? So that makes sense that this -1 number is when we look at the marginal return at that particular labor point, it's going to be negative. It's going to be below the y-axis, x-axis, right? One of those few times that it is. So questions on this? Okay. All right, so let's have our TikTok break, and then I'll do a quick Kahoot, and then we'll do a little bit of practice, and then we'll jump back in tying up, fixed costs and variable costs and things like that. So we'll pick up on page 148 to, if you want to read before class, which I highly recommend for getting good class scores, 148 to 160 for Thursday's class. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this.